Most of the times it's going to be easier to go through really fast like so, and all I just did was to click where there are no events, or you could even click above the ruler here, and from that point just drag. You can see as you move the mouse back and forth, it's just a really quick way to go back and forth in the footage here. Now you'll also notice that as I'm doing this, I've created this blue area, and that's actually a really cool feature in Vegas called a time selection. What that does is actually define an area on your timeline, and that starts and ends at a specific point. So once this time selection is made, you can just ignore it and just move somewhere else and scrub there. And so don't let those bother you, even though you're not really referencing them anymore. You might just want to scrub through a piece of footage and then do something else. And it's okay if it just sits there on a timeline. It will collapse anyway after you click somewhere else, although it leaves behind the top header from the time selection, otherwise known as a loop region. As you see, if I hover over here, it says the loop region area. So what happens with time selections? Well, for one thing, let me just go get the part with the truck in here. Once that's defined, if you hit play, and let me just turn the sound off, I'm going to mute that audio track. If you play with the time selection active, it's going to play through and then stop, and only play in that time selection. So that's actually pretty handy for a lot of editing functions, because you're going to be working on one little piece of your timeline at a time. Sometimes you inadvertently create a time selection by, instead of clicking sometimes, you might accidentally drag the mouse a little and you create a time selection. And of course, if we play from here, it's only going to play that second or two. If you need to kind of break free of a time selection, it's easy to do. Just hit your arrow key, and that will step it out past the time selection. And if you need to get back your last time selection, just go ahead and hit backspace. And it actually remembers the last 5 time selections. So I'm going to just toggle through the last 5. And let's get the one that just has a truck there. That's probably it. There we go. And one thing we can do while we're working on something, if we really want something to repeat over and over again, to either just review it or make changes while it's playing, we can put this in loop mode. And there's a little button down here on the transport controls that looks like a circular arrow. Or you can hit the Q key as a shortcut. And you'll see the very top here has now changed to a dark blue. And what's going to happen when we play this is it's going to play the loop region or time selection over and over again. Now something else a time selection will help us do is determine how long a particular event is. If you need to know that information, just double click on an event. The time selection automatically forms from the very first frame to the last frame. And I'm going to go ahead and turn looping off. We don't want that to loop unnecessarily. And let's look at the bottom right of the interface here. You see it says 2507. So that indicates that it's 25 seconds and 7 frames long. That tells us instantly how long that event is. It also tells us the beginning point on the timeline and the ending point, so the in and out points of that time selection. It will also do the same thing if we want to define a gap between events. Just double click, and again we have a time selection and we can see the exact duration. And here's a cool trick. We have talked about zooming in and out of the timeline with different ways, but if you really want to home in on a certain section really quickly, let's say we want to work on this event. Once you make a time selection around it, choose Control Up arrow, and the timeline will instantly zoom to just a little bit wider than whatever your time selection was. Let's look at a few more properties of the time selections. If you want to adjust the actual duration of a time selection and where exactly it starts and ends, you can do that actually by dragging the edges. Just hover over the edge. You see the cursor changes to that left and right arrow, and just click and drag. Also, we're using snapping here, which is on by default. That's going to snap to the edges of events. So that's adjusting the in point, the out point, or you can drag it by these little yellow triangles at the very top. And something I should mention is that you actually can drag out a time selection when you click right on top of an event. Of course, normally if you click and drag, the event is going to move back and forth. You usually don't want to do that. But if there's nowhere else to click, if there's no empty space to click in, if you have a lot of things going on, you can hold the Control and Shift keys and then click and drag right on top of the event, and it won't affect the position of the event. Notice also one little detail is that one edge or the other is going to be blinking, and that's the active edge. Right now you see the out point is blinking, and that is in fact what we're seeing in the preview. If we move around the in point and let go, that's going to be the active edge there. But there's also a way to change the edge using the keyboard, and that's with the home and end keys. So home is the in point, end is the out point. So you can easily switch back and forth to the beginning of the time selection to the end of the time selection. Now this is especially handy when you're looking to define an area that you're going to cut out. It really helps you imagine what the edit's going to look like if you were to cut out a piece of video here and then close the gap up together, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Another way to define the edges of the time selection are using the Shift key, and it's going to move the active side of the time selection, whether that be the in or out points. Right now we have the right edge or the out point of the time selection. If you hit Shift and then click somewhere else, it's going to expand the time selection to that point. So hit the home key and now the leading edge or the in point of the time selection becomes active. Hit Shift and then click and it will expand out there. Now if you click on the other side of the active edge, the whole thing is going to flip around. And so right now the in point is active. I have Shift activated. I'm going to click over here. The entire time selection basically flips over, and now the former out point becomes the new in point. So let's put this to a little more practical use in a few ways.